What would you do if the people you loved most tore your heart out, smiled in your face, and called it what's best for the children? It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday no one remembers until it rips you apart. The air smelled of dish soap and rain, and her hands were still wet when the phone call came. 3 sentences, that's all it took to change the geometry of her life. They said it like they were reading off a grocery list. The boys are with us now. You won't be seeing them for a while. And then the click. She stood in her kitchen listening to the silence grow teeth. You think you'll cry in moments like this, but know some grief doesn't spill, it burns. The neighbors saw her later hanging laundry, her movements calm, almost bored. But you know how some women keep their storms under their skin. She was one of those. The quiet mother they used to call her, though no one really knew what lived in that quiet. Her children gone, taken by the people who had smiled at her table, eaten her bread, and whispered, "You're doing so well," while plotting their theft. And you, if it were you, would you have begged, called them, promised to be better? She didn't. Not once. She knew begging was for the powerless, and she was not powerless. The days after were a strange theater. Her ex-in-laws, the self-appointed saviors, paraded her grandsons through the town square, posting photos online about family unity, while erasing her name from every caption. The smugness in their faces could have curdled milk. They believed they'd won. They believed her silence meant surrender. But silence, when chosen, is a weapon. She began to watch them the way a hawk watches a mouse. No confrontation, no scenes, just notes. Who came to visit? What time they left? The smells of expensive wine drifting from the open windows. The murmurs of new furniture deliveries. A quiet tally in her mind of every indulgence and debt. It's funny, isn't it, how the people who steal from you never imagine you could steal back. One night she walked past their house and saw the lights blazing in every room. The home her late husband had built, the home she had dusted, painted, bled into, now filled with their laughter, their children's toys, their framed certificates on the walls. They thought it was theirs. But paper is thin, deeds are thinner, and the law, if you know where to look, can be a scalpel. She started visiting an old friend, a retired clerk from the county records office. They drank coffee and talked about hypotheticals, about joint property, about titles with forgotten clauses, about what happens when taxes are paid late or not at all. She learned to move like a shadow in daylight, filing here, requesting there. They didn't notice the letters from the assessor's office. Or if they did, they thought they were nothing. Weeks later, she sat at the back of the courtroom, her cardigan neat, her face unreadable, while the papers were read aloud. No shouting, no gasps, just the soft clink of the judge's gavel declaring ownership. Hers. When they got home that evening, a notice was nailed to the door. They had 30 days to vacate. And here's the part you need to understand. She didn't do it for revenge. Not exactly. She did it because they needed to remember the one truth they had tried to bury. She was still the woman who had built this family. She was the one who could give and take away. When they came to plead, she listened. Not because she cared for their excuses, but because it's important to let people hear their own desperation. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat. She simply looked at them the way the earth looks at rain patient, unbothered, knowing it will come and go. They left with their boxes. The boys went with them, still too young to understand what had happened. But seeds were planted, memories of a grandmother who did not disappear, who could not be erased. And if you're wondering whether she cried after they were gone again, she didn't. She lit a candle, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat in the chair by the window watching the moon rise over the house she had taken back. The next morning she found their garden gloves on the porch railing, palms stained, green fingers bent like the hands of a petty saint. It amused her. Even their attempts at caretaking were a performance. Inside the house, the smell of vanilla cleaner had faded, and the old timber breathed again resin and dust and the faint ghost of her husband's tobacco. She pressed her palm to the hallway wall as if checking a fever. The house felt cooler, almost relieved. You think walls don't remember, but they do. They know the voices that lied under their roofs. Word traveled, of course. It always does in towns like this where gossip is a sacrament. The saviors suddenly looked smaller in the grocery aisles, pushing carts heavy with apology pastries. Their smiles found the floor. The bravest among them tried to laugh, tried to cast her as vindictive. You know that laugh, don't you? The one that rings like thin metal? But when they said her name, their eyes darted like minnows. It's curious how people respect what they fear. What they ignored was the slow build before the rupture. That's how betrayal arrives on tiptoe. It had begun the year her son married the golden daughter of a family that specialized in spotless reputations and emotional IOUs. The bride moved like light through glass, soft and precise, with a way of tilting her head that implied both grace and warning. She brought scented candles that smelled like expensive lemons and rules that smelled like bleach. She hosted dinners and ranked the laughter around the table in her mind, awarding points for loyalty. You've met her, haven't you, the one who performs kindness like it's a pageant and treats love like a ledger? At first, she let it slide. She watched the girl rearrange her kitchen drawers, gingerly relocate her spices, giggle about modernizing. She noted the way her son, who had once built forts from cardboard and mud, nodding with the solemnity of kings, began to seek permission for his own opinions. The young wife was the shadow stepping where others stood, taking their shape until they doubted they had cast it. The quiet mother saw it and did what quiet mothers do, she observed, and she prepared. You might have told her to confront it, to demand respect, but you're used to cheap fire. She practiced a slow burn. Then came the boys' sunlight at breakfast, hands sticky with jam, the thud of small feet that reset the clocks of the house. She was gentle with the daughter-in-law, the way you are with fragile porcelain that believes itself diamond. She offered afternoons naps in the blue room, little sweaters that smelled like lavender. She offered until offering felt like a trap set for her. There were jokes about boundaries, raised eyebrows when the boys returned home sleepy and smiling. There were comments about influence, about structure, about how the children needed a consistent narrative. You know the vocabulary of erasure. It starts clinical, ends biblical. The first real bruise landed on a Thursday when the shadow wife phoned, voice syruped with apology, to say they wouldn't be coming by. The pediatrician had recommended limiting excessive stimulation. What she meant was limiting a grandmother who did not bow. A week later, a family counselor appeared in their group chat like a newborn star, offering articles about healthy hierarchies. The ex-in-laws, suddenly experts in child development, clucked over links and spoke about attachment figures. They laced their theft with public concern. It's always concern, isn't it, when people want your life in a tidy box they can carry away. She remembered standing at the sink, a dish in her hand, hearing the words and feeling something in her ribcage quietly fold its tent. She did not argue. She did not defend. She cut the lemon cake, she wiped the counter, and she began collecting documents. The camera in her eyes turned, the light in her voice dimmed to a pilot flame. That's when you would have called someone, begged for a reasonable conversation. She chose a different language, the one written in signatures and deadlines. The day they announced the boys wouldn't be seeing her for a while, she received it with the calm you reserve for weather. People think calm is weakness. It's insulation. She went walking at dusk, her hands in the pockets of a cardigan the color of old bone, and mapped the town by its habits. The shadow wife's mother overspent at the boutique and undertipped. The father liked to boast, but the boasting had turned brittle, debt-shaped. You can read a family by its receipts. Now, with 30 days left on the nailed notice, the house watched them unravel. They tried calling her mom again when they came by, the way you try a key that doesn't fit anymore. The shadow wife cried without smudging her makeup, which is a skill passed down like a hymn. She spoke about the boys needing stability. She spoke about not uprooting them. She clutched a tote bag that said gratitude in gold script. The quiet mother saw the trembling underneath the fear of a woman whose throne was not bolted to the floor. And maybe you feel a twinge for her, the girl who learned control because safety was never offered. Compassion is cheaper than surrender. The quiet mother could afford it. But compassion did not mean concession. She told them the truth without vinegar. The property had been mishandled, the taxes mispaid, the deed misassigned. She told them the judge had stamped the solution. She spoke as if reading out a recipe, measure, fold, bake. The son couldn't look at her. He had once found worms after rain and presented them like prizes. Now he shuffled in his own skin. The quiet mother felt the old ache, the wish to gather him by the collar of his childhood and save him from himself. She did not. You shouldn't either. That rescue is how the story stays broken. On the 20th day, a moving truck groaned up their drive. Cardboard boxes like small coffins lined the grass. The boys hopped on the porch steps, counting under their breath, already learning that adults could turn life into a series of numbered obligations. She met their eyes and smiled steady the way a lighthouse keeps its beam, unafraid of fog. She didn't tug them close, didn't press her scent into their hair. She wanted their memory of her to be the smell of courage, not the smell of crying. And you watching this with your jaw tight, are you beginning to understand the difference between retaliation and restoration, between begging for a seat and building the table? She wasn't petty. She was precise. She wasn't cruel. She was clear. Night found her alone again, the room's larger the moon, a coin on the windowsill. She counted her breaths, then the creaks of the staircase that returned as if from exile. The house had changed temperature. The story had too. The next chapter would require a steadier hand, a deeper cut. Taking back the home was not the end. It was the opening of the real book. You feel it, don't you, that hinge inside you turning. The first week after they left, the silence was not the kind that comforts. It was the kind that presses against your chest, testing the strength of your ribs. She moved through the rooms like a curator in a museum of her own life, touching the edges of things, assessing what could stay, what must go. The curtains they had hung white gauzy pretending at innocence came down first. They smelled of fabric softener and unspoken rules. She folded them once, then dropped them into a trash bag without ceremony. You might think she did this for catharsis, but no. It wasn't about purging their presence. It was about reclaiming space without apology. There's a difference. Throwing things away to feel better is just cleaning. Removing what never belonged is an act of authority. She found herself noticing the small damages they'd left behind. A scuff on the baseboard from an unkind kick. A chip in the kitchen tile from something dropped in anger. A photo hook in the hallway where their framed family portrait once hung the wall behind it, slightly paler as if even paint had been excluded from their light. These marks didn't hurt her. They documented the truth. She left them untouched for now, as one leaves evidence before the court. And here's the part no one tells you: when you take something back that was stolen, people will try to make you feel like the thief. The phone calls began, some polite, some dripping with sanctimony. Cousins who hadn't spoken in years suddenly became ambassadors for reconciliation. A church acquaintance offered to mediate. One message unsigned read simply, "Shame on you." She read each one like weather reports, noting the storms preparing her coat, but never letting them change her course. The boys sent a postcard once. It was clearly their mother's handwriting, but the words were cheerful enough. "We're doing fine. School is fun. We miss the garden." No return address. She placed it on the mantel, not because she believed it, but because she wanted them to know someday that their voices had reached her, however scripted. You wonder maybe if she ever considered giving the house back, if the weight of it, the history, the paperwork, the stares at the grocery store ever made her think it wasn't worth it. The truth is, she did consider it. For exactly 12 minutes one evening, sitting on the porch steps watching a storm push in over the hills. But then she remembered the day they took the boys, the way they spoke to her as if she were a guest in her own bloodline, and the thought dissolved like sugar in rainwater. The town adjusted slowly. Neighbors began to wave again cautiously, the way you wave to a dog that might bite or might wag its tail. The mailman lingered at the box, asking after her health. Even the grocery clerk stopped pretending not to see her. Power changes the shape of your shadow. It either shrinks you or stretches you until people can't ignore your outline. She didn't spend her days plotting revenge anymore. That chapter was finished, filed, and bound. Instead, she began to restore the house in small, deliberate acts. She repainted the blue room not for the boys, but for herself, a color deeper than before, almost stormlight. She planted rosemary along the front walk, knowing it would take years to mature, but confident she would be here to watch it. She hired a carpenter to repair the loose stair, not because it was dangerous, but because she refused to live with the creak they had ignored. Sometimes in the evening, she would sit in the front parlor with the windows open, listening to the sound of children playing somewhere down the street. She didn't strain to hear their voices. She knew they were not hers to claim in this season, but she let the sound of joy, even borrowed joy, fill the rooms. That's something you learn only after being stripped bare. Joy doesn't have to belong to you to nourish you. The shadow wife didn't disappear. She still posted curated happiness online, filtered sunlight matching outfits' captions about gratitude and blessings. But the edges were fraying. People whispered about their sudden move to a smaller rental, about the husband's new job that wasn't quite as prestigious. The boys looked older in each picture, their smiles less certain, as if they were starting to read between the lines. One night her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just 2 words, "I understand." No name, no context. She knew it was her son. She didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, but because sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the space to grow their own spine. And you, if you were in her place, could you have resisted the urge to fix him, to tell him it was all right? She didn't resist out of coldness. She resisted because she loved him enough to let him carry his own consequences. That's a rarer form of love than most people can stomach. By the second month, the house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a fortress. Not a place to hide, but a place to command from. She had no illusions that the story was over. Families like hers, with their secret ledgers of loyalty and betrayal, never end neatly. But she was no longer on defense. She had the high ground, and she knew how to hold it. The day she saw the shadow wife in town pushing a cart alone, there was no rush of triumph, no spiteful glee, only a quiet recognition, like seeing a bird you once fed now scavenging for itself. The woman glanced up, met her eyes, and quickly looked away. That was all. No words, no fight, just the silent exchange between two generals who know the war has shifted. It was in the third month that the house began speaking to her again, not in words, but in the subtle ways a place breathes when it knows it's safe. The air was warmer, less stale. Floorboards sighed under her steps instead of groaning. Even the kitchen clock, which had ticked unevenly for years, seemed to settle into a steady rhythm. You might think it's foolish to believe a house can sense its owner, but tell me, haven't you ever felt unwelcome somewhere without anyone saying a word? She woke earlier now, not because she had to, but because mornings no longer felt heavy. She'd make tea and sit in the bay window, watching light spill over the hills. It wasn't the boys' laughter she heard anymore. It was the wind through the rosemary she'd planted, the distant murmur of the town coming alive. You see, healing doesn't always arrive as joy. Sometimes it comes as the absence of dread. The shadow wife stayed mostly invisible. People said she was adjusting to their new circumstances, though the edges of the story were suspiciously neat. One mutual acquaintance mentioned in the casual tone people use when they want their words to stick that she'd been seen crying in her car outside the school. The quiet mother didn't gloat. She simply filed the image away, not as ammunition, but as proof that the story had begun to rewrite itself without her lifting a finger. Then came the letter. Not a text, not a call, an actual letter in her mailbox, folded in thirds inside a plain envelope. Her son's handwriting, unsteady but deliberate. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for the house back. He only wrote about the boys, how the oldest had started drawing, how the youngest had learned to whistle. At the end, one line stood out. I think they're starting to remember on their own. That was the first time in months she let herself cry. Not the sharp, hot tears of anger, but the kind that cool you from the inside, leaving you lighter. You might think she'd run to him, then invite them over, but she didn't. She tucked the letter in a drawer with the deed side by side, two kinds of ownership she refused to misplace. The town's whispers shifted again. Now they spoke less about her boldness and more about her strength. A neighbor she barely knew brought over fresh bread unasked. Another offered to help repair the old shed. This is how power works. When you hold it quietly, people begin to orbit without knowing why. One afternoon, while clearing the attic, she found a box she hadn't seen in years, her late husband's journals. She sat on the floor dust coating her palms and read page after page of his precise, slanted script. In one entry written decades ago, he'd described building the house. A home isn't walls. He'd written, it's the promise that the people inside it are safe from those who would take what they haven't earned. She closed the journal, her throat tight. He would have understood everything. It was in that moment she decided to change the locks. Not because she feared anyone would try to come back, but because she wanted the keys to match the truth that the house was hers alone, now not shared, not borrowed. She chose solid brass locks, the kind that feel like they could outlast storms. The change rippled inward. She replaced the dining table, the one they had sat at with their careful smiles and polite betrayals. The new table was heavier raw oak with knots that told their own story. She invited no one to sit at it, not yet. It wasn't a table for strangers to rehearse affection at. It was for people who didn't flinch at silence. And maybe you wonder, was this all just about a house? The answer is no. The house was the symbol. The real reclamation was invisible, the refusal to be erased, the quiet rewriting of her place in the family's mythology. They had tried to recast her as a footnote. She'd made herself the spine. One Sunday in the grocery store, she saw the boys for the first time since the eviction. They were with their father, not the shadow wife. The oldest spotted her first. His eyes widened, and then without asking, he walked over and hugged her. No performance, no permission, just a boy claiming what was his. The youngest clung to her leg, grinning up at her, as if nothing had happened. She didn't ask them questions. She didn't mention the past. She just held them in the middle of aisle 3 between the cereal and the bread until their father cleared his throat. She met his eyes. He didn't look away this time. There was no apology, but there was something else, a kind of surrender, not to her but to the truth. He took the boy's hands and said, "We'll come by." She nodded once, not smiling, not pressing. Some doors, once locked, should open slowly. That night she walked through the house barefoot, each step, a quiet inventory of what she'd kept, what she'd lost, what she'd taken back. The house felt full, even empty. Outside, the rosemary bent in the evening breeze, its scent drifting through the open windows like a promise kept. You might think this is the ending. It isn't. The ending isn't when you win. The ending is when you stop needing to. The visit happened 3 weeks later, unannounced, on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter. She was upstairs sorting linens when the knock came, 3 slow raps, the kind that expect patience. She opened the door to find her son, the boys, and to her surprise, the shadow wife standing with a bakery box in her hands, like it might shield her. No one spoke at first. The boys barreled past her into the hall, kicking off their shoes and running toward the blue room as if they'd never left. Their laughter ricocheted off the walls, waking something in the house. She stepped aside without comment, letting them flood the silence. The shadow wife's eyes were different this time, less glass, more stone. She held the box out. "I baked," she said, her voice steady but low, as if she were trying not to echo. The quiet mother accepted it, not because she wanted cake, but because refusing it would have been too small a gesture for the moment. "Tea?" she asked, and it was not a question so much as an opening. In the kitchen, they moved around each other like 2 dancers who had once fought over the same spotlight. The son leaned against the counter, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes flicking between them. He didn't speak. Men rarely do in these moments. They wait to see who wins before deciding what they believe. Over tea, the shadow wife talked about the boys' school, their new routines, the art projects piling up on the fridge. She spoke carefully, as if trying to prove she had nothing to hide. There were no sharp jabs, no barbed compliments, just facts delivered without the scaffolding of superiority. You've seen this before, the slow dismantling of a persona when its architecture can no longer hold. The boys drifted in and out, showing drawings, asking for biscuits, tugging at sleeves. The quiet mother answered them all with the ease of someone who has nothing to prove. And that perhaps was the most unsettling thing for the shadow wife, to be in the presence of a woman whose value didn't require her approval. When they left, the shadow wife lingered at the threshold. She hesitated, then said, "I know what you think of me." The quiet mother didn't correct her. She simply said, "I know what you've shown me." It was not forgiveness, and it was not condemnation. It was the truth, and sometimes truth is sharper than either. After the door closed, she didn't rush to the window to watch them go. She cleared the cups, wiped the counter, and let the house settle around her. The visit hadn't erased the past, but it had tilted the ground. Power no longer flowed in one direction. In the weeks that followed, the boys came more often. Sometimes with their father, sometimes alone for an afternoon, occasionally with the shadow wife who never came empty-handed but never stayed long. The house adapted to their presence again, but without the old tension, no one trying to rearrange drawers, no one measuring her worth against their own imagined ledger. And here's the thing, you might think she softened because they returned. But her softness wasn't surrender. It was choice. She had learned the difference between being needed and being wanted, and she no longer mistook one for the other. One evening after the boys had gone, she sat in the blue room and realized the ache in her chest was no longer raw. It was just space. Space where grief had lived, now open for something else. Not joy, not yet, but readiness. That's the quiet victory no one applauds, when you make room for what might come without demanding it hurry. The shadow wife sent a message one night, just a photo of the boys asleep in their beds. Hair rumpled, mouths slack with innocence, no caption. The quiet mother saved it, not as proof of peace, but as a reminder some wars end not with treaties, but with small, unguarded offerings. The house, too, had its own way of acknowledging the shift. The rosemary outside had begun to flower tiny pale blooms against the green. They weren't loud about their arrival. They simply existed, fragrant and inevitable. She brushed her hand over them one morning, and the scent clung to her skin all day. By the end of summer, the story no longer belonged solely to her or to them. It had become something the boys would carry, a story about a grandmother who had been told to disappear and instead made herself impossible to forget. You can't teach that in words. You teach it by living it in full view. And maybe you're thinking now that revenge was the heart of it. But no revenge ends when the other side is broken. What she wanted was for them to stand in the truth, even if it burned. And she got that. The shadow wife no longer spoke about boundaries like they were walls. The sun no longer avoided her eyes. The boys knew in that unspoken way children do who had kept the ground beneath their feet steady when everything else shifted. One late night she stepped outside and looked at the house from the garden. The windows glowed warm, the walls standing sure, the air smelling of rosemary and rain. She thought of her late husband's words, and for the first time she didn't feel the sting of loss in them. She felt their weight as an anchor holding her exactly where she belonged. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.